So as mentioned, my name is Brent Smith. I'm a professor at Rice. I've had the luxury for the last about 8 years being the associate dean or senior associate dean in charge of corporate education, which basically means I spend all of my time working with companies and helping them understand how to develop talent, particularly how to develop leadership talents in their organizations. I guess the one thing that may not have mentioned about me, which is something I reluctantly admit to most audiences, and that is I'm a psychologist. Actually, not bad. Particularly when I'm dealing with energy companies and I tell them I'm a psychologist, I get this like long guttural moan. Whoa, really? A psychologist? Yeah, I'm actually a psychologist. All of my education, all of my training, my entire background is in psychology. I actually never took a class in the business school before I started teaching classes in the business school. Right? So I walk around Rice, in the Jones School as kind of this unadulterated psychologist in this land of adulterated management professors. But I think that makes me kind of uniquely qualified to think through this issue of talent. Because at the end of the day, the factors that are most interesting to companies are the factors that are really focused on understanding the psychology related to attracting and maybe even more importantly, retaining the best quality talent in the industry. So that's my area. If you had any interest whatsoever in my research, you would find that a lot of my research focuses on understanding the personality characteristics of ineffective leaders. Any guesses why I focus on ineffective leaders?
So you won't be one.
I'm sorry?
So people won't be one.
So you won't be one, right? Well, that would be a good reason. I can't exactly say my reason is a good reason. But I see your point. There's a business model there, right? If I could just figure out ineffective leaders, then I can, sell my services to people and otherwise augment my meager academic salary. Right? That's not my reason.
Everybody has
They're more of them. Well, I can honestly say in certain industries, I suspect that's true. Right? Still not my reason.
Because we tend to learn from our mistakes.
Or we tend to not learn from our mistakes, right? Which I find incredibly fascinating. Right? It's amazing to me the frequency with which people don't. Right? That would be a good reason too, though. Because if you can learn something from those characteristics, then maybe you can prepare people to avoid it. Right? I'll be honest with you. Think about it this way. What is interesting to a psychologist? Functional and effective people? Not a chance in hell. Come on. The only thing that is interesting to a psychologist are the deep-seated dysfunctions you find in truly ineffective people. Right? That's fascinating stuff. Right? So, what I'm going to talk about today is this broad topic of talent, and I'm going to approach it a little bit differently than maybe you might expect, and that is I'm going to quiz you. Right? So I'm going to expect a little bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask you some questions about organizational perspective on practices related to managing talent. Right? And I will tell you right now, my underlying thesis is very simple. You will be substantially more successful. You will be substantially more effective as an organization if you take a sophisticated and broad approach to understanding the talent problem. And that's not one simple magic bullet. It's not one. Yes.
Sorry, we can't hear you on the back row.
Very uncomfortable. This is weird. So.
Well, we do that. It's a psychological exam.
Got it. Thank you. Well done. Yeah, very well done. Very well done. Anyway, as I was saying, my basic thesis, is that the more sophisticated you are in thinking about the basic practices that you use to manage talent, right, the more effective you will be at attracting and retaining it. At the end of the day, the answer to most problems when it comes to talent is how you have built a brand as an employer, right? And how you build a brand as an employer is a function of many, many, many different things. Not just what you say. It's not marketing material. It's once you get people in the door, how do you treat them? What are the practices that are in place to manage them? How do you develop them? Right? And how do you promote their careers? So that's what we're going to focus on in this talk. So just to set this up, I'll skip past that. That's just a lot of people basically saying that talent is important. So let's flip through. So a growing concern. I kick off most of my leadership classes, executive leadership classes, with this basic slide, and it goes back to the late 1990s. Another time when, because of the dot-com explosion, people were concerned about this war for talent. Right? This was a survey that was done by McKinsey, called the War for Talent. Data were collected roughly in 1997. A book was published around 2000 that focused on this talent shortage problem. This is a survey that was sent to about 7,000 managers and executives across a number of different multinational organizations. I'm showing you the responses to only 3 questions. Those questions, basically paint a very pessimistic view of people's perceptions of the quality of leadership and management in their organizations. So our company has enough talented managers to pursue all or most of its promising opportunities. Only 7% of respondents were convinced that was true of their company. We are confident that our current actions will lead to a stronger talent pool in the next 3 years. Only 9% were convinced that was true of their company. Our company has enough talented managers to substantially increase our performance relative to our competitors. Only about 11% were convinced that was true of their company. That paints a really pessimistic view, right? Particularly internally, people thinking about management within their own organization. So my question to you is, what do you think causes this? Do you think it's always been this way? That's a non-rhetorical question. Yes, it has always been this way? Yes. Well, let me give you a little more data. So this was published in around 2000. If you go back to the late 1960s, right, there was a similar survey done. And when I say similar, I mean so similar, I'm pretty sure I know where McKinsey got the idea to do theirs. And it was done by the University of Michigan. This one is a little bit more global, but the one that was done by the University of Michigan, again, late 1960s, was primarily US, but asked almost identical questions. Now, in the late 1960s, what do you think these numbers look like? The same, higher, or lower?
Much higher.
Yeah, not just a little bit higher. These things that are hovering around 10% in the late 1960s were hovering around 50 to 55%. Now, that is a huge dip. I mean, if you're a sociologist and you look at that kind of change, something very dramatic, has happened to affect people's or employees' perceptions of their organizations. Right? So my question to you, and this is a very important question, what happened? Yes?
Increasing job mobility.
Increasing job mobility. Now, what does that mean? That sounds almost euphemistic.
People moving shorter lifetimes per job.
Why? So he said increased job mobility, people moving around a lot. The question is why?
Technology, easier, a number of factors that make it easier to move from one job to another.
But basically you're saying for some strange reason, employees are less committed to a single organization than they once were, right? For a variety of factors. So it's not just mobility. It's not just that there are many more jobs open. It's just that for some reason I'm no longer committed to
Well, there's a lower barrier to moving also.
Okay. Did you have your hand up, sir?
Yeah, employers became less committed to the employee.
Employees became less committed to the employee, and how is that?
So, the employee became almost like a commodity instead of a valuable part of the corporate team.
So what he basically said, and he used very, very interesting language. He said that employees have tended to become a commodity, right? Tradable, hireable. If this one doesn't work, we'll replace it with this one, rather than something that is a human capital investment, as we would say these days. And I think that more than anything else, actually, if you look at the recent research that we're doing, explains this nosedive in employees' perceptions of the quality of management in their organization. Think about it this way. The example I usually give is if you went to work for a company like in one of the companies I work with, IBM. If you went to work for IBM in 1965, why were you at IBM?
Well, you were there because they had a significant brand in the U.S. You expected that you were going to be working for a very innovative company and that you likely had employment for life.
Exactly. That latter factor. So it was certainly the brand, it was certainly the kind of organization, but that latter factor was something that was really common. The idea that I'm going to go to work for IBM and I'm going to have a job for life. It's a very simple exchange, right? I'm going to trade you my loyalty, you're going to provide me job security. I'll give you an honest day's work, you'll give me an honest day's pay, right?
And maybe what's happened, you listen to the two answers. I mean, I would say that the employment contract between the enterprise and the employee has changed, and it's been a change on both sides. For one thing, a lot of the young professionals that we hire today have no intention of working for us.
Exactly. Now this is the problem, right? So why? So if you think about it, IBM in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, started to go through a wave of downsizing, right? I mean, every major organization, right, in the United States, starting really in the United States, in the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, went through this massive wave of downsizing and restructuring, or re-engineering, whatever you want, or right-sizing, or delayering, or, again, whatever euphemistic term you want to use to basically say thinning out the ranks, flattening the organization, moving people out of middle management. Well, as soon as an organization downsizes, what does it do to that contract? That's based on loyalty and job security. Right? And by the way, when I use the term contract, I don't mean the unimportant one, the written one. I mean the extremely important one, the psychological one, which explains why I should be committed to an organization. Right? And so as soon as a company downsizes, that psychological contract goes away. It just gets torn to pieces. Right? But it has to be replaced by something. That's the wonderful thing about a psychological contract. There always has to be one explaining why people choose to work for your organization and why people choose to be committed to your organization. Right? So in the absence of this job security kind of element of a contract, what has it been replaced with?
Well, I would offer to you that my sense from talking to some of the young people today is that they come into the industry with a little different perspective than many of us did. They are taking control of their own development. And so one of the things they want to know is, during whatever tenure I have with you, how are you going to increase my own personal resume and my own desire to achieve what I perceive I need in order to do the work I want and get the fulfillment I'm looking for?
You get an A+.
You got to hit those three things.
You get the gold star today.
You got to understand, he's in the industrial sector.
Okay.
The only industrial sector here, I believe. Everybody knows Randy, I believe, with S&B. He started, he's not.
You're in the wrong side. Okay, got it. But you're dead on. And actually, it crosses industries. Right? That's one of the reasons why I think this is such a foundational issue right now. Is that what has replaced this notion of I'll give you my loyalty if you provide me job security is that I'll give you my loyalty so long as you're willing to make investments in me. Right? In the absence of job security, that investment, the one that makes sense for employees, what we even train it in business schools these days, is that what investment can you make in me to grow my capability, to grow my skills, so I can create my own sense of job security, right? And that is, if you can't promise it to me, then I've got to take ownership of it myself. And the way that I'm going to create my own job security is to build that portfolio of skills and capabilities that will make me indispensable either to this organization or to the industry. Right? So the more you make the investment, the more you're likely to maintain the commitment and loyalty, the more you'll reduce your turnover, the more simple attraction will be, right, in recruitment, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the changing landscape. And that's actually, I think, largely what these numbers say. As you downsize, as you restructure, as you maybe focus on employees as commodities, what you're not doing is making investments in people that will help you build that brand, that will help you then attract and retain people. That's kind of the nature of the game. Okay, now what I'd like to do, that was a backup. By the way, I've seen, just to kind of finalize on this point, in the energy industry, I've seen probably over the last 5 years 6 or 7 surveys that have been done, some by the majors, some by kind of mid-sized exploration and production companies, some by services companies, that have focused on trying to understand what drives the next generation of employees, right? Because they seem to be a little bit different from the older generations of employees. And if you look at those surveys, what's really quite striking is that they all tend to yield basically the same conclusion, and that is what motivates, what creates that commitment. In the top 3, in some order, but usually in this order, number 1 is something around development, investments in people. The second is something around an appropriate work-life balance. Right? And the third is usually something around compensation and pay. Right? But interestingly, compensation and pay is not number 1. Right? It's what are you going to do for me in terms of building my capabilities and my skills. And that's the one area where, particularly in the energy industry, the large companies, have the luxury maybe of having invested more. The mid-sized and small companies haven't at all. Right? It certainly creates a little bit of a problem. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead into this, given the amount of time that we have. What I'm going to do is to test some of your knowledge about organizational capability and management of talent, right? And see if we can maybe even question some of the assumptions that your organizations might practice. So there are a lot of these. I'm not going to go through all of them. If some are more interesting than others, I'm more than happy to stop and discuss them for a while. But this is interactive, meaning you have to give answers. So it's just a series of statements, and you tell me if they are true or false. Okay. So first statement: top performers are many times more effective than low performers.
False.
False. Top are not. No. Now, how many people say false? How many people say this is true? Overwhelmingly, this one is true. Right? overwhelmingly, I mean, across many, many different circumstances, across many, many different industries, across many, many different types of jobs, the distribution of performance is actually quite vast, right? And I just pulled out just some anecdotal evidence. The first one is probably from the most important study that's ever been done of this. But if you look at knowledge workers, people in kind of more professional ranks, the gap in productivity between the top 1% performers and the average performer is about 127%, right? Just to give you some other kind of really interesting anecdotes, if you look at classical music, 16 composers composed 50% of all the music that's currently played today, right? That's sizable. If you look at, I don't have it up here, but, oh yeah, I do. 10% of the authors represented in the Library of Congress are responsible for 50% of the books that are archived in the Library of Congress. I should tell you something about productivity differences. There's been a lot of, I do work with a lot of technology companies like Microsoft and Research in Motion. And if you look at research in that area, programmers, the bread and butter of technology companies, basically shows that the most productive programmers are 10 times more productive than the least and 5 times more productive than the average in terms of the number of lines of code they write. The reality is there's oftentimes an enormous difference, right, in the capabilities of top performers and average performers. Right? Now, I should tell you something about the processes that we put in place to select people into our organizations. What I found in my field, where I kind of have a tendency to specialize, is that organizations pay much less attention to the procedures and processes to hire talent, to select the right talent, than they should based on the benefit associated with getting the right people in the door. And in fact, overwhelmingly, the practices and procedures that organizations use to hire talent are oftentimes the ones that are the least valid in predicting actual success and productivity of employees. And so what do you think? What is the most common mechanism to select among different candidates? What procedure do organizations use? Interviews. Interviews are wonderful. Would you ever hire someone without interviewing them? You feeling set up? What do you think is the validity of the most common method of interviewing? Just unstructured, sit down, read through the CV or the resume and make a decision.
It's becoming more multiple interviews.
Well, even multiple interviews you would think would be better, right? Because you're getting multiple people's opinions. Yeah. Sadly, the validity of the typical procedure that we use to hire people, the validity of that, its relationship with performance is virtually zero. In other words, it is unrelated in its typical form. Yes, economist?
Is it at least good at making sure you don't hire people from the left side of the distribution?
It is not, right? Right? Because if that were true, then you would have some relationship between the two, right? If you were just curtailing the left side of the distribution, you would have, you would have an effect of range restriction, right?
How do you know, right? Maybe they're only hiring people from the right side, and then you're just looking at the variance between right side.
This is not going to be an economist psychologist out there. I'm trying to make it up.
You've got the
These economists and these econometricians think that they're all sophisticated when it comes to statistics. I can tell you these psychologists are just as sophisticated. We still get the credit for it, damn it. No, I will tell you that this is probably one of the best documented findings, right? I would encourage you to think seriously, as a starting point for any discussion around talent, is to think seriously about the procedures that you use to hire people, right? At the professional level, all the way down to the skilled level. Right? That is the gateway. That is the starting point. If you make bad decisions in hiring talent into your organizations, meaning that you're not hiring talent into your organizations, you will exacerbate every other problem that you could possibly imagine. Right? The one that is probably most common is if I treat employees like commodities, right? That, you know what, I can hire anybody, and if they don't work out, then I'll just kick those out the door and I'll go get some more, right? The productivity loss in your organization as a function of that is enormous. But more importantly, the cultural ramifications of that in your organization are even worse. Because you're sending a very explicit message. People aren't that important. We'll try them out. If they don't work, then they're gone. It's a labor-based model as opposed to a human capital-based model. Just a quick anecdote about this kind of basic element. For about 3 years, I happened to have a chance to work with 2 companies here in Houston that were direct competitors of one another. I won't name the companies. Let's just say they're geosciences companies. They help energy companies find oil. So they're organizations of geologists and geophysicists and statisticians and all that kind of stuff. And they were direct competitors. One of them I would describe as the ultimate human capital company. Right? They made huge investments in people. They had very sophisticated human resources practices. Right? The other was the classic labor company. We'll hire people, we'll pay them if they don't do their job, then we'll send them out the door, and then we'll hire somebody else to replace that person. And over time, what I noticed in working with the heads of HR in these two companies, is that the company that was the labor-oriented company, they ended up paying about a 20 to 25% premium, right, for people to work in that organization, just because of the cultural characteristics and the known brand, around people that company had. Even with that premium, whenever a job opened up at the human capital company, what do you think happened? Right? What's funny is that these two companies geographically are very close to one another. So saying that one would walk out the door across the street to the other was pretty accurate. Right? And it was all built around the culture and brand that the company had created because of the investments that they were willing to make. Yes?
Were people willing to take less compensation to move laterally from one to the other?
Yes. Yeah. And very frequently, actually, very, very frequently, because of the quality of work, the quality of the investment, and effectively the promise, right, that one company was making to them. And that promise was, we'll make the investments, we'll define your career path, right? We'll let you know what the end goal is going to be for you, right, so that you can aim towards something. Right? The other was, here's your compensation. Right? And then we won't talk about where you're going in this organization. But if you rise to the top, maybe that there's an opportunity for you. But it was all unstated. Right? So those two cultures were very different, and it was easy to pull and suck the best quality of one company out and into the other. Okay. An outgoing, engaging, charismatic personality is an important component of being an effective leader. True? False. False. How could that be false? Yeah, you're right. It's you don't trust me. Now you're just going to give me the, okay, this is not going to work if you just give me the option that you think is, least likely, right? Absolutely dead on false. Right? I mention this because, oftentimes the very characteristic that we most frequently look at, in defining, success in terms of management and leadership roles, we actually know is probably the least indicative of success. Like charisma. Charisma have the people that have this, this really unnatural belief in the importance and power of charisma, as a tool in management. If you look at all the research that we've done for maybe 15 years, on charisma and management, charisma and leadership, it leads to a few disappointing conclusions. Right? Number one, it's just as frequently a description of someone who is truly ineffective in a management role as it is a description of somebody who is effective in a management role. So looking for something like that as an indicative of success, it's not going to be very helpful to you. Charisma is very rare. Right? Only about 4% of the population of managers in for-profit companies possess it. Right? So if you think it's the model, I'm sorry, it's a pretty rare phenomenon out there. And lastly, we don't know how to train it. Right? So if it's only 4% and you think it's a critical element of success in management, and you don't have it, I can't really help you. You're kind of screwed, right? Sorry. But fortunately, it doesn't matter, right? And my point is, these elements that we oftentimes think about, or actually even sometimes non-consciously have a biasing effect on how we evaluate someone, right? Unless we kind of set them aside and really look at broader factors, it will force us into or lead us down the path of selecting people into management ranks in our company, when we probably shouldn't. When actually it's going to have a more negative effect than a positive effect.